You're listening to The World at 8 with Lynn Mozart. The World at 8, the number one in nationalist news.
Highlights of the news today, Monday, 2nd of February 2015. Thought for the day: are we in danger of being taken for a ride, or when history stops being factual but starts becoming propaganda? Cultural differences: Nigerian GP who gropes suicidal woman keeps job. Arm all police with tasers to fight terror war. Miliband is entitled to £63,000 a month publicly funded transport. German students angry at being forced to attend march against anti-Islamisation Pegida rallies. Michael Moore whining about death threat from 84-year-old Clint Eastwood. Czechoslovakia's dawn of direct democracy leader Okamura says we must not share or tolerate their values. Egyptian court sentences 183 Muslim Brotherhood supporters to death. And finally, Tuferwunday Munday. UK news. Cultural differences: Nigerian GP who groped suicidal woman keeps job. Dr Emmanuel Kanu stroked her breast, repeatedly tried to kiss her and told her "you want it" when she tried to escape his clutches during the visit, which he hid from colleagues. When she later texted him to tell him to stop ringing her, he withheld his number on the next call. But Kanu, a married Nigerian father of one, has been allowed to keep his job by a fitness to practice panel, even though the General Medical Council called for him to be struck off. He told the panel he had not molested the patient and claimed cultural differences led to the visit on September 3, 2011, saying, "There is a clear divide between the doctor and the patient here, which is very different in Nigeria." But the Medical Practitioners Tribunal Service only suspended the 36-year-old for 6 months, despite finding he was guilty of sexually motivated serious misconduct. A report into his actions stated that he put his arm around her and stroked her chest. It added she informed the panel she was scared, frozen to the spot, and said I was unsure he was a doctor. Kanu, who worked at Borders General Hospital near his home in Melrose, Roxburghshire, was acquitted of sexual assault at Durham Crown Court in 2012. World at 8. I wonder how well that excuse would work in Nigeria. The Brits are losing their effing minds. Of course, Nigerian GPs all work that way, don't they? Cop a feel every time a woman sees them. Cultural my backside. Arm all police with tasers to fight terror war. Every frontline police officer should be offered a taser to help fight the threat from lone wolf terrorists, a police leader declared yesterday. Steve White, who chairs the Police Federation, said evidence of plans to murder officers made the move necessary. The terrorist ideal to get attention no longer relies on an attack being in a place of note, he said. It could be in Cheam High Street or any town in any part of the UK. We know there are more dangerous people out there preparing to attack police officers, and we need to be able to respond to that threat. Steve White, who chairs the Police Federation, said evidence of plans to murder officers made it necessary for every frontline officer to be offered a taser. Leaders of the Police Federation are set to vote next month about whether every uniformed officer should be offered training in the use of a taser. The terrorist threat level for police was raised to severe 2 weeks ago in the wake of the Paris atrocity and a foiled assault on officers in Belgium. Since then, police chiefs and junior officers have been considering how to counter the extra dangers. Last December, a threat was made to kidnap and kill a policeman in the West Midlands. Officers were given extra security briefings and urged not to travel to work in uniform. Leaders of the Police Federation, which represents rank and file officers, will vote next month on a proposal that every uniformed frontline officer should be offered training in the use of tasers, though some may choose not to carry them. The weapons, which carry an electric current of up to 50,000 volts to incapacitate dangerous suspects, have been linked to at least 10 deaths in England and Wales over the past decade. Some senior officers are believed to support the idea in theory, but one police leader said chief constables would be mostly opposed. The police chief, speaking anonymously, told The Guardian, "The idea of arming every police officer with a taser is alien to 200 years of police culture. It is a stepping stone to arming the police. Something strapped to your hip that looks like a firearm is a huge shift in what we stand for." World at 8. Tasers? Hell, give 'em guns. Miliband is entitled to £63,000 a month. Publicly funded transport. The taxpayer shelled out £757,000 on transport for Ed Miliband last year, amounting to £63,000 a month. The money was used in part to chauffeur Miliband around the country in his desperate bid to shore up his leadership. Miliband is entitled to publicly funded transport in his capacity as Leader of the Opposition in the House of Commons. During his first year in the job he spent just over £600,000. Since then, costs have gone up. The figures revealed by the Daily Mail are in stark contrast to the costs incurred by other political leaders. Conservative Stephen Crabb got rid of the official car used by the previous Welsh Secretary when he was appointed to the post last year. Eric Pickles has also cut the communities and local government departments' spending on ministerial transport from £488,000 during the final year of Labour government to £191,000 last year. Labour have been trying to claim government ministers are on the gravy train because of their transport costs. However, that party were left red-faced in 2011 when they were caught removing first-class signs before an interview on a train with Miliband. I'm no kafar says, "This is a small price to pay for a great statesman, politician, philosopher, economist and socialist supremo who happens to be a bit confused as to what the latter descriptor actually means. This man stands astride the world of politics like a pygmy, and every one of his nasal utterances is pounced upon for meaning. He reminds me of a quote by the inestimable Winston. He has all the virtues I dislike and none of the vices I admire. You know he is worthless. Sorry, I meant worth it. Oh, what the hell. Stay safe, everyone." European news. German students angry at being forced to attend march against anti-Islamisation Pegida rallies. From blazing cat fur, 1,000 students from the 5 schools of Lübeck, Europe, were forced to demonstrate against the rapidly growing anti-Islamisation Pegida around Germany, and were given posters to carry promoting freedom, diversity, openness, respect and tolerance, freedom of expression and religious freedom, human dignity and freedom of the press. Ideas that are not now, nor ever have been, part of Islam. The schools and the police gave a positive assessment. However, students and parents took to the social media to criticise the compulsory attendance at the event. Counter-demonstrators carried signs welcoming mass Muslim immigration. On the Facebook page of LN Online, students complained about being forced by the school administration to march in the parade, regardless of how they felt about Pegida. "It was a compulsory event for us students. I had to be there and my presence had to be verified," one student wrote on Facebook. The heads of the 5 European schools reject the allegation. "The demonstration was recognised as a school event with compulsory attendance," said Stefan Kosmos, head of the Friedrich List School, even though school officials at the Ernestine School claimed that students who did not wish to participate in the demonstrations were allowed to stay away from school. World at 8. Would have been good to see on any news in the UK the actual ethnicity of those who welcomed mass Muslim immigration. Czechoslovakia's Dawn of Direct Democracy leader Okamura says we must not share or tolerate their values. About 500 people gathered in the central square of Prague and protested against Islamisation and Muslim immigrants in the Czech Republic today. The crowd listened to speeches by Tomio Okamura, leader of the junior opposition Dawn of Direct Democracy, and Jana Wolfová, head of the Czech sovereignty movement. A moment of silence was held for the victims of Holocaust and Islamic terror. With banners "We don't want multi-culti" and "Czech land for Czechs, not for worshippers," and flags with crossed out mosques, the protesters then marched to the Interior Ministry, calling on it to check immigrants and more controlled churches so there are no intolerant people in them. In his speech in the square, Okamura called on the country to defend itself against the enemy ideology of Islam that wants to abolish democratic principles. "We must be tolerant, but this cannot be one-sided. We must not share or tolerate their values," Okamura said. About 40 people gathered in the square before the protest against Islam, mocking the slogans of the opponents and promotion the idea of minorities living together in peace. Earlier this week, President Miloš Zeman called for joint international military operation against Islamic radicals. Foreign Minister Lubomir Zaoralek rejected Zeman's call, labelling such a crusade nonsense. Zeman said Zaoralek's view reminded Zeman of the policy of appeasement of the 1930s when the Western powers made concessions to Nazi Germany. World at 8. With the best will in the world, you cannot compare Germanic culture with the so-called culture of the desert. Different, completely different. It does not belong in Europe in any way, shape or form. World news. Michael Moore whining about death threat from 84-year-old Clint Eastwood. After almost a decade of irrelevance, Michael Moore is desperately using the American sniper controversy, where he calls soldiers cowards, to try and claw back his way to fame as if it were a chicken sandwich. But Moore is running low on material, so now he's playing the victim of an 84-year-old man. He posted on his Facebook page a message entitled "The Day Clint Eastwood Said He Would Kill Me 10 years ago this week," and that included in conclusion that those who issue scathing verbal attacks are akin to Islamic State terrorists. 10 years ago, this past week, Clint Eastwood stood in front of the National Board of Review Awards dinner and announced to me and to the crowds that he would kill me if I ever came to his house with my camera for an interview. "I'll kill you," he declared. The crowd laughed nervously. As for me, having just experienced a half-dozen assaults in the previous year from crazies upset at Fahrenheit 9/11 and my anti-war Oscar speech, plus the attempt by a right-wing extremist to blow up my house, he was caught in time and went to prison. I was a bit stunned to hear Eastwood out of the blue make such a violent statement. But I instantly decided he was just trying to be funny, so I laughed the same nervous laugh everyone else did. Clint, though, didn't seem to like all that laughter. "I mean it," he barked, and the audience grew quiet. "I'll shoot you." There was a smattering of approving applause, but most just turned round to see what my reaction was. I had tried to keep the fake smile on my face so as to appear as if he hadn't gotten to me, but he had. Clint Eastwood would have been 74 at the time. He was also clearly joking. The deadpan thing is as close as he gets to comedy. So either Moore was terrified that a 74-year-old major director would shoot him, or he's desperately milking for this attention. And this is the guy calling American soldiers cowards. World at 8. Perhaps he has finally lost it. Who is he anyway? Egyptian court sentences 183 Muslim Brotherhood supporters to death. An Egyptian court has sentenced 183 supporters of the outlawed Muslim Brotherhood to death as authorities continue to crack down on Islamists. The men were convicted of playing a role in the killings of 16 police officers in the town of Kadasa in August 2013 during the upheaval that followed the army's ousting of Islamist President Mohamed Morsi. 34 were sentenced in absentia on Monday. Egypt has mounted one of the biggest crackdowns in its modern history on the Brotherhood since the political demise of Morsi. President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who as army chief toppled Morsi, has described the Brotherhood as a major security threat. The death sentences followed one of the bloodiest attacks on Egyptian security forces in years. Islamic State's Egyptian affiliate claimed responsibility for a series of coordinated operations that killed at least 32 people on Thursday. World at 8. Lovely. That'll teach 'em I love a bit of Muslim on Muslim. Thought for the day. Are we in danger of being taken for a ride, or when history stops being factual but starts becoming propaganda? Now, I want it carved in stone. Lynn Mozart is not a Holocaust denier. Why? Because you have to be a retard not to know that something went on during the Third Reich that they thought would take the Jews out of their country and their lives. After all, I'm not a Muslim, and they deny it ever happened at all, to whatever numbers or stats. That is idiocy on a grand scale. But to balance that out, haven't we all been taken on a 70-year-old Shiva sitting? I think maybe we have. You see, history is continually being rewritten to suit the plan, which is also being continually rewritten to suit political and economical climates, and I mean internationally and on a grand scale. There are quite a few elite from every walks of life, except poor, who dictate down the line as to what and how the general public of any country, whether democratic, communist or generally don't know, are allowed to know certain facts. But not all. This is what the church did in this country during the Middle Ages. Only the monks were allowed to learn to read and write, and only churches and monasteries had books, so the peasants virtually knew just what they were allowed to know, and nothing much has changed since. We may be the most photographed and tagged nation on God's earth, but we're also the most bigoted and uninformed, especially on history, because both the educational facilities know that too much information in the wrong hands produces questions and unedifying facts which no one wants to acknowledge. Amidst all the Holocaust celebrations and visits from people who should know better to places that should have been obliterated, as most murder houses are and have been, are quite a few survivors of the Holocaust. Although getting fewer by the year, there must have been many survivors from various camps, which proves they were not as efficient in getting rid as we like to think they were. After all, and in paybacks of hell, the Israelite tribes decimated entire cities in biblical times, and whole tribes were wiped out completely without the help of gas chambers and the Germans, who were at that time quite happily wandering around Germanica wearing fur skins and grunting, but very organised grunting at that. A real shocker was the appearance of Lawrence's mother at the huge and celebrity-orientated vigil in Westminster. That is the only case I know of where the killing of a son has benefited the rest of the family. Odd, isn't it, as he wasn't Jewish, was he? Prince Charles said the memory of the Nazis' diabolical enterprise was relevant in today's conflicts and should help people to reflect on how to respond to recent horrors. His poignant remarks made at a national commemoration marking Holocaust Memorial Day came as thousands of people gathered across the country to remember the 6 million Jews killed in the Holocaust on the 70th anniversary of the liberation of the Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp. World leaders also joined around 300 Holocaust survivors at an event on a site at the former concentration camp. What a picnic. The event in London came after the Chancellor George Osborne announced the government is going to contribute £50 million towards a new Holocaust Memorial and Education Centre to be built in the capital. The hugely sombre commemoration was staged amid tight security at the Central Hall in Westminster, coming just 3 weeks after the Paris massacre in which 4 Jews were killed. Among the audience were elderly Holocaust survivors and their families. Prime Minister David Cameron, Labour leader Ed Miliband, Liberal Democrat leader and Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg, Chief Rabbi Ephraim Mervis and the Duchess of Cornwall. Sir John Hurt, Michael Palin, Sarah Lancashire and Christopher Eccleston were amongst those who gave readings. Actress Helena Bonham Carter and Doreen Lawrence, mother of murdered teenager Stephen Lawrence, now a peer, also attended the commemoration. Now bear in mind it was 4 Jews in Paris, not 4 million. Millions of Christians are dying every day in Africa and many Arab states, and no one has memorials for them in a Christian church or cathedral, not one. Also odd is the number of Jews killed, which has gone up in the years since the end of the war. I believe it was nearer to just below 5 million, and the rest was made up by the significant number of political prisoners, homosexuals and others. By the way, many of the early Jewish prisoners were Marxists and believed traitors to the Prussian government then in charge. Concentration camps are not new in Europe and still exist. The British are to thank for the innovation of these, which they created to house the Dutch Boers in South Africa, and in which thousands, if not millions of Boers died as well. The Belgians also made use of them, as did the Yanks in the Civil War or the War of Secession. Nothing new in the number of the poor bastards who passed through or didn't either, just a very unpleasant part of the human psyche. In the days of old, you killed your enemy down to the last child. Now that is not acceptable, so you build a retraining, working, rethinking and rehousing facilities which are in truth prisons. The latest to suffer in the concentration-type pickies were the Serbs, who had put the militant Muslims behind the wires, and with that came amnesty in the UN with pickies that frankly didn't shock me at all. We don't know what these prisoners did to qualify for that treatment, but at least most survived, amply cosseted by the powers that be, who of course saw that never would that happen again. No, they're right. No Muslims are killing Christians because they're too bloody lazy to build and oversee concentration camps. Back to the Holocaust, which is of course one of the thousands throughout the world's history and should be viewed just as that. Awful, but it will happen again, because in the human mind is a thought that we have to go round in ever-diminishing circles to reach the same conditions we had 100 years before, so the circle can go round once again. Rather like lemmings. View that some of the camps started off with fairly good intentions. Of course many didn't. It depended on the class of prisoner you were. But the ones with mainly women and children were the ones which were not important to the Reich's war effort. And when food got scarce, which it did in Germany and Europe in the early years of the war, owing to us and the Allies bombing everywhere, Why feed people who didn't count when your troops and officials and indeed your own people had to be fed? Many Jews died of starvation and illness alone. Terrible, but it applied across the board in the years. The Japanese usually didn't take prisoners, but when they did, very nasty things happened indeed. But not to the Jews, who, bless them, could make money out of everything, even terrible events. There is no denying that going from door to door and getting members of the Jewish communities out of their beds and into the nearest hellhole they could find, but this has been going on for years amongst other countries and still is. It's just there's no money to be made out of it. Do you think Stephen Lawrence had been the only black male killed in this country and other countries? No. Just a case suitable for the Diversity Brigade to soften up the white peoples to accept millions of ethnics into this country. Sad, but true. Now, as we are playing the numbers game, how's this one? The communist Russians killed in Eastern Europe 20 million people, men, women and children, all mostly white Europeans. Now that is true genocide, when you kill your own culture brothers. The Muslims don't acknowledge that the killing of anyone else other than a Muslim is of any importance at all, and we must, in the Western world, adopt the very same thinking, but of course in reverse. The Muslims are, if not anything else, honest. They want to wipe out every Jew and Christian off the face of the earth, and no one punishes this thought pattern at all. In fact, we ignore it. Now, what happened to the Jews in Germany was awful, but we Brits and the Allies played a part in it as well. There were rumblings in the late 1920s that the German people were sick and tired of hosting a people who proved cleverer than they were and were of a different religion and were Semites. But no one wanted to take even the wealthy German Jews in at all. They were refused entry to all the countries in the Western Hemisphere and the Americas. Only a very small proportion got away, and that was to Switzerland, who wouldn't turn down a Wookiee with money. Some had got away much earlier that century to the States and England. But the sad truth is the Jews were not wanted, and so we left them there to perish, or many of them. Their blood is on the hands of all the European countries, not just the Third Reich, which could account for all the weeping and the wailing over the French business and Palestine. It's all guilt-ridden. But should the world keep paying through the nose for what could be exaggerated facts? The Germans, whilst not the most pleasant people on earth, are not the only ones to have killed in the name of patriotism. The Japanese carried out horrific medical experiments that more than obliterate Dr. Mengele's ones, and rarely is the word spoken about it. Why? Because they experimented on non-Japanese, but not Jews. Head of these programs was the young army doctor Shiro Ishii. At the time of Japan's surrender, he held the rank of Lieutenant General, the highest rank achievable in the medical corps. From the beginning of his military career, Ishii enjoyed the patronage of key figures within the Japanese High Command. From the start, Ishii engaged in involuntarily human experiments. Ishii came into his own in Manchuria shortly after the Japanese seized control of the region in 1931–32. With the protection of the Kwantung Army High Command, also known as the Kanto Army, the Kamputai, secret Japanese police, and local police collaborators, Ishii engaged freely in extensive research on innocent victims in his laboratories in the city of Harbin, later in Banyi, and still later in an extraordinary facility in Harbin's suburb known as Pingfang. It was completed in 1939, containing more than 150 buildings, including 2 secret prisons and 3 crematoria, and was the largest human research centre in the world. Each year hundreds of prisoners were fodder for fiendish experiments. They were exposed to every known disease. These ranged from anthrax to yellow fever. Some were used for hypothermia experiments, others were forced to endure gangrene experiments, and still others were forced to engage in sexual intercourse with individuals known to be infected with venereal diseases. You would think, with all the truly horrible things that happen every day and every year on this wonderful planet, that one single nasty would take its place in a general roll call of man's inhumanity to man, but it doesn't. The Jewish-controlled media after the war took the line of the victim. That is, practically ignored the poor survivors, and it didn't allow them into ersatz Israel, but made millions of dollars in living the lie, or rather living in the exaggerated form of it. And nowadays the victim is the king of victims. It pays to be a victim, not a victor these days. And the papers are full of victims and sympathy, which it doesn't really feel. Millions upon millions of other poor souls are being killed, murdered, mutilated, tortured, enslaved, branded, and all are victims, not just the God's chosen people, who have the knack of ignoring their brothers who do not share their religion, rather like the Muslims in that respect. Esther Ranson, of course jumping on the Jewish bandwagon, finished an article with the sentence, "Jews, Christians and Muslims are being persecuted, etc." No, Esther, Muslims are persecuting Christians mainly and talk about persecuting the Jews. And when push comes to shove, the Muslims will kill anyone who is not Muslim. It's as simple as that. And far worse than a Germany who is sick and tired of an alien culture which in the Middle Ages it paid them to take in. The Jews, Christians and Muslims are not being persecuted by the far right as intimated. All religions are under fire in our Marxist Labour society, but the only ones to deserve it are the Muslims. They are not European and they are not in any way of the Christian Judaic belief, whatever they may spout. They are a man-made religion and as such are faulty. And to our media, stop grovelling to the Jewish belief that everyone exists on this earth to persecute the Jews, and Osborne should be shot for giving £50 million to a new Holocaust centre. What's he thinking of when our army veterans and youth are barely surviving with all the grants going to ethnic and non-Christian sources? Get a life, matey, for God's sake. We're all God's chosen, aren't we? And finally, firstly there were the Welsh who prayed on their knees and on their neighbours. Secondly, there were the Scots who kept the Sabbath and anything else they could. Thirdly, there were the Irish, who never knew what they wanted but were always willing to fight for it anyway. Lastly, there were the English, who considered themselves a self-made nation, thus relieving the Almighty of an awesome responsibility. I love this one. This joke was sent to me by one of my listeners, God bless him. White guy and a black guy go to the barber's. White guy is first and asks the barber to completely shave his head like Telly Savalas. Barber finishes and says that'll be £3, sir. Black guy goes next and asks barber to shave his head as well. Barber finishes and says that'll be £6, sir. But the black guy says his was only £3. Barber says yes, sir, but it's double for a coloured telly. Oh, bum bum. And a little extra for a week's laugh. 5 surgeons are discussing who were the best patients to operate on. The first surgeon says, I like to see accountants on my operating table because when you open them up, everything inside is numbered. The second responds, yeah, but you should try electricians. Everything inside them is colour-coded. The third surgeon says, no, I really think librarians are the best. Everything inside them is in alphabetical order. The fourth surgeon chimes in, you know, I like construction workers. Those guys always understand when you have a few parts left over at the end and when the job takes longer than you said it would. But the fifth surgeon shut them all up when he observed, you're all wrong. Politicians are the easiest to operate on. There's no guts, no heart, no balls, no brains and no spine, and only 2 moving parts, the mouth and the arse, and they're interchangeable. You've been listening to The World at 8. I am Lynn Mozart and I wish you all a very good night.